She rested her head on my shoulder, and for a moment, it felt like she'd always belonged there, like time had folded just for us. The first time I truly noticed her, it wasn't during any dramatic moment. It was in the quiet rhythm of everyday life. My landlady, a woman in her early 40s, moved through the building with a gentle authority that felt natural rather than forced. She wasn't loud or demanding, but there was a certain confidence in the way she carried herself, an effortless grace that drew the eye without trying. I would see her in the morning, unlocking the lobby door, humming softly to herself as if the world existed in a private, comforting soundtrack just for her. I couldn't help but watch, at first almost unconsciously, the way she arranged her small potted plants on the window ledge, brushing a leaf gently with the tip of her fingers. The way her hair fell loosely across her shoulders, catching the morning light like strands of copper. There was a warmth in the way she greeted neighbors, never too formal, always considerate. And I felt a quiet admiration brewing, a feeling I wasn't used to noticing so clearly in someone older than me. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something more fragile, a mixture of fascination and respect. I'd often find myself lingering in the hallway, pretending to check the mailbox, just to catch another glimpse of her. The faint scent of her perfume would drift through the stairwell, a subtle mix of floral and something earthy, and it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite name. My hands would sometimes twitch with the impulse to reach out, not to touch exactly, but to close that small, almost sacred distance that always seemed to hover between us. And yet, she didn't demand attention. She moved in her world as if I were only a quiet observer, someone who existed on the periphery of her day. But every small gesture, the tilt of her head when she smiled at someone, the soft sigh as she settled into the lobby chair, was loaded with an unspoken warmth. Even from a distance, I felt it like a vibration, a subtle pulse of connection that didn't need words. In those early days, the tension was entirely one-sided, me trying to decipher what it meant to care this much about someone who barely knew I existed. I noticed how her eyes lingered on little details, how she seemed attuned to the small rhythms of life. The way the sunlight shifted across the floor, the sound of leaves scraping against the window, the quiet tapping of her shoes on the hallway tiles. I wanted to understand her world, even just a little, and somehow, I felt that she was inviting me in without ever asking. This first keynote isn't about action. It's about observation, emotion, and the subtle magnetic pull that forms between two people before words or gestures ever make it tangible. It sets the stage for everything to come. A slow-burn connection rooted in quiet awareness, subtle longing, and the anticipation of closeness that will one day be reciprocated. It happened by chance, or maybe it was fate, though I wouldn't have admitted that to myself at the time. I was carrying a stack of mail up the hallway when she appeared at her door, balancing a small tray of tea. We collided, not harshly, not dramatically, but enough for a few envelopes to slip from my hands and flutter to the floor like oversized autumn leaves. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, crouching to gather them. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice calm and even, as though my clumsiness were the most natural thing in the world. She leaned slightly forward, and in that subtle movement, our shoulders brushed. Then, almost without thinking, she rested her head on my shoulder, light, fleeting, as if it belonged there but hadn't fully claimed the space yet. Time did something strange in that moment. The world around us, the faint hum of the heater, the distant murmur of neighbors, even the soft thud of envelopes hitting the floor, faded. I became acutely aware of her warmth, the softness of her hair against my shirt, and the faint scent she carried, something floral, comforting, and distinctly her. My own heart raced, but I didn't move away. I didn't know if I could. It was a brief contact, barely more than a heartbeat, but the weight of it was undeniable. She pulled back almost immediately, offering a small, apologetic smile that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," she said, as if she'd done me a favor rather than the other way around. There was no lingering word, no hint of acknowledgement beyond that subtle smile, but the memory of that shoulder, of that warmth, stayed with me long after. I walked away, my hands still trembling slightly, replaying the incident in slow motion. How her hair brushed my chest, How her head had felt impossibly light, yet somehow grounding. The gentle rise and fall of her breath. Every detail imprinted itself on me, leaving a small ache that was equal parts longing and wonder. That brief accident opened a door I didn't know existed. I realized that this wasn't just curiosity anymore. There was a subtle, almost forbidden desire in me. A need to feel her near, even in the smallest ways, even if society would have whispered that it was inappropriate. And yet, the moment was perfectly innocent, perfectly human. A fleeting connection born of accident. A touch that felt both accidental and predestined. From that day forward, the hallways felt different. The way she moved, the way she leaned into small gestures, the way she carried herself. It all held new meaning. Every glance, every brush of her hand against mine, even something as simple as handing me a tray of tea, became a tiny stage for tension and closeness. This keynote is about awakening, the first physical closeness that awakens emotional awareness. It's delicate, quiet, and powerful, setting the tone for the slow, inevitable pull between them. The audience should feel the electricity in the small, almost mundane moments, knowing that the story's heart beats in these fleeting touches. By now, the hallways and shared spaces of the building felt less like mere passageways and more like stages for quiet connection. Our encounters had become more than chance. They carried the weight of familiarity, a rhythm that neither of us had consciously acknowledged yet. My landlady, in her early 40s, moved through her world with that same gentle confidence. But there was a new layer to her now. One of openness, subtle vulnerability, and quiet attention directed toward me. It started with small conversations. She would pause at the mailbox, ask how my day had been, comment on the weather, or offer a fleeting insight about life. And I began to listen. Not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, the soft inflections in her voice, the flicker of emotion that passed across her face before she tucked it away. She spoke about things I hadn't considered before. The patience required to care for a home, the delicate balance between independence and companionship, even the strange, small joys that come with age and experience. I found myself learning from her in ways I hadn't expected. Not in lectures or formal lessons, but in these quiet, shared moments. When she gestured toward something, her hand would sometimes brush mine lightly. Nothing intentional, yet enough to send a shiver through me. When we both reached for the same object, our fingers would touch briefly, lingering slightly longer than necessary, almost testing the boundaries of propriety. It was subtle, unspoken, but electric. There was something intoxicating about the way she offered guidance, not as authority but as companionship. She never made me feel small for my inexperience, nor did she flaunt her own wisdom. Instead, she shared it softly, as though letting me into a secret corner of her world. And I wanted in. I hung on every word, but even more, I hung on the quiet intimacy that accompanied them. The way she would lean slightly closer, the tilt of her head, the occasional soft laugh that seemed to be reserved just for these moments between us. Even mundane activities carried this gentle mentorship. Folding laundry together in the lobby, watering her small plants side by side, or sharing a cup of tea in the soft glow of afternoon light became lessons in patience, attention, and care, not only for our surroundings but for each other. Each touch, each fleeting brush of her hand against mine, was a punctuation in the growing narrative of us. By the end of these early days, I realized that this mentorship was more than guidance. It was a bridge, an unspoken invitation into her world and, in turn, into mine. My emotions were no longer just curiosity or admiration. They were recognition, longing, and an awareness that our connection was becoming something quietly profound. This keynote builds the emotional foundation of the story. It shows that intimacy isn't just physical. It is found in shared experiences, tender gestures, and subtle touches. The audience should feel the slow, magnetic pull between them, the way life experience and youthful curiosity merge to form a bond that is gentle, meaningful, and irresistibly human. It was in the quiet, unremarkable evenings that our connection began to feel weightier, more palpable. The hallway lights softened the edges of reality, turning mundane spaces, the lobby, the the stairwell, the small sitting area, into private stages for subtle intimacy. She invited me to join her for tea one evening, ostensibly to help carry a few cups to her apartment. But I knew, even as I accepted, that there was something unspoken in the way she looked at me. We sat close on the small couch, shoulders brushing occasionally, each contact light and accidental at first. But as the minutes stretched, so did the space between accident and intention. I noticed her leaning slightly toward me, the weight of her presence settling in a way that was both grounding and disarming. Her hair occasionally fell forward, and I found myself brushing it back gently, almost instinctively. The motion was natural, almost tender, and it carried a quiet intimacy that words could never capture. The conversation flowed easily, about books she'd recently read, the music she preferred on rainy afternoons, the way she sometimes found comfort in watching life unfold from her window. And yet, there were long pauses, pregnant with unsaid thoughts, that felt heavier than any dialogue. I caught myself watching the way her eyes caught the light, the subtle curve of her smile when she laughed softly, the way her hand would rest on her lap before inching closer to mine without acknowledging it. Every glance, every tilt of her head, seemed loaded with meaning. There was a closeness that felt almost inevitable, as though the universe had conspired to make this ordinary evening extraordinary. The warmth of her body near mine, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the soft aroma of tea, made my chest tighten with an unfamiliar awareness. Time slowed, and I realized that I was acutely conscious of every detail, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the occasional brush of our knees against each other, the soft, rhythmic cadence of her breathing. It wasn't desire in the crude sense, it was subtler, deeper. It was the feeling of being needed and noticed simultaneously, the pull of companionship that bordered on longing. I sensed her tension mirrored my own, a hesitance balanced with a silent acknowledgement that something was stirring between us. And in that unspoken understanding, I felt both excitement and hesitation, thrilled by the nearness, yet wary of overstepping some invisible boundary. By the time she finally stood to retrieve something from the kitchen, I felt a faint ache in the space she left behind. The lingering moment, the touch, the shared silence, the weight of what could be, remained suspended in the air. It was a quiet revelation. Intimacy didn't always need words or declarations. Sometimes it existed in the space between heartbeats, in the gentle pressure of proximity, in the slow, inevitable rhythm of two people drawing closer. This part of the story cements the slow-burn nature of their relationship. The audience should feel the electricity in these lingering moments, the subtle magnetism that grows without rushing, and the profound emotional awareness that deepens with every quiet encounter. It's in these small, intimate spaces that the foundation of trust, attraction, and tentative longing is truly laid. It wasn't until a few weeks into our quiet routine that I began to feel the weight of what was growing between us. Our interactions, once simple and comforting, had started to stir a new kind of awareness in me, one that was thrilling but also troubling. I realized that my admiration for her, the respect that had first drawn me in, was morphing into something more complicated, desire tempered by hesitation. I found myself replaying moments in my mind, the brief brushes of her hand against mine, the warmth of her head on my shoulder, the way her laughter lingered in the air longer than necessary. Each memory was accompanied by a subtle ache, a recognition of the taboo that hovered between us. She was older, experienced, a woman whose life carried depth and history that I could only glimpse. And yet, here I was, noticing every curve of her smile, every nuanced expression, and feeling a pull that I couldn't, and didn't want to, ignore. At the same time, I was painfully aware of the social boundaries, the judgments that might exist in the outside world. A part of me questioned whether my emotions were appropriate, whether I should pull back before they became something undeniable. But then I'd catch a fleeting look from her, soft, attentive, almost imperceptibly inviting, and my resolve would crumble. There was no declaration, no overt gesture, only the subtle affirmation that our connection was reciprocated, even if quietly. She sensed my tension, though never directly. It showed in the way she lingered in conversations, in the way her hand would lightly rest on my forearm when emphasizing a point, or the gentle pressure of her shoulder as we moved side by side in the hallway. These touches were brief, delicate, perfectly balanced on the line between intimacy and propriety. And yet, each one landed like a whisper against my skin, stirring thoughts I wasn't ready to name. I began to understand that my attraction wasn't just physical. It was emotional, intellectual, and deeply human. Her confidence grounded me, her vulnerability drew me in, and the subtle ways she showed trust created a bond one couldn't ignore. But with that awareness came conflict. The fear of misreading signals, the dread of moving too fast, the internal argument between desire and decorum. I wanted to lean in, to close the distance, yet part of me hesitated, terrified of shattering the delicate balance we'd built. Even as I wrestled with my feelings, I noticed her own quiet hesitations. The slight pauses, the fleeting glances, the micro-expressions that hinted at emotion she didn't voice aloud. It was as though we were both navigating invisible lines, sensing the growing pull while trying to maintain equilibrium. And in that tension, the intimacy deepened, more powerful because it was tempered with restraint. This part of the story emphasizes the inner conflict that comes with slow-burn romance. The audience should feel the push and pull, the longing restrained by awareness, the hesitation charged with desire, and the emotional complexity that makes their connection real, human, and compelling. It's in this tension that the story gains its depth, preparing for the emotional peak to come. The moment came quietly, without fanfare, in a way that made it feel inevitable yet impossibly fragile. It was late afternoon, the golden light of the sun spilling through the hallway windows, casting everything in a warm, forgiving glow. She had come down to fetch something she'd forgotten, a small stack of letters, and found me sitting on the lobby couch, lost in thought. There was a heaviness in her eyes, a subtle vulnerability that I hadn't seen before, and in that instant, I realized that the world had narrowed to just the two of us. Without a word, she leaned closer, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, rested her head on my shoulder. This time, it wasn't fleeting or tentative. It felt deliberate yet natural, as though her presence belonged there by unspoken right. The warmth of her body pressed against mine, soft and grounding, and the faint scent of her perfume, warm, floral, familiar, enveloped me. I froze, afraid that any sudden movement would shatter the delicate balance of the moment. Her breathing was quiet, rhythmic, a gentle rise and fall that seemed to echo the slow thrum of my own heart. I became intensely aware of the softness of her hair brushing my chest, the slight weight of her head, and the subtle pressure of her shoulder against mine. Time stretched in a way that was both suspended and profound. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of trust, intimacy, and unspoken desire. I didn't move, couldn't. I felt her tension ease as she settled more comfortably against me, and I realized that she, too, had been holding back. That small act, resting her head on my shoulder, was both an admission and an invitation. It spoke of trust, of vulnerability, of a connection that words could never fully capture. Every nerve in my body became acutely aware of her presence, and every thought of hesitation dissolved into the quiet certainty that this moment mattered more than anything else around us. We sat like that for several minutes, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. It wasn't about rushing forward or defining what we were. It was about existing together in a shared space where boundaries blurred just enough to allow intimacy to flourish. I felt the strength of our bond in the simple act of holding space for each other, the warmth of emotional safety in the quiet gravity of proximity. And in that suspended moment, I knew that everything had changed. This was the emotional peak, the culmination of weeks of subtle touches, lingering glances, and unspoken tension. It was the moment where admiration, longing, and trust converged, creating a connection that was both tender and electric. The audience should feel the depth of the bond, the power of restraint, and the profound human intimacy that doesn't need words to be felt. This scene sets the stage for the resolution, where the characters will acknowledge the gravity of their emotions and consider the delicate balance between desire, propriety, and emotional connection. It is the heartbeat of the story, where slow-burn romance reaches its most poignant and visceral expression. After that afternoon in the lobby, everything felt subtly shifted between us. The simple act of her resting her head on my shoulder had broken an invisible boundary, opening a space where honesty and vulnerability could exist without fear. But it also demanded clarity, a reckoning with feelings we had both been cultivating quietly for weeks. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was a gentle, necessary acknowledgement of the bond we had formed. A few days later, she invited me to sit with her in the sunlit hallway, the same space where our closeness had first felt inevitable. She carried her usual calm confidence, but there was a softness to her expression I hadn't seen before, a quiet invitation to share the truth of what lingered in both our hearts. I could feel the warmth of her presence even before she spoke, the subtle gravity of someone who trusted me with the fragile corners of her life. We talked, carefully at first, about the weeks we had spent together, the moments of accidental touch, the laughter, the silent understandings. I admitted the ways I had been drawn to her, the confusion and longing that had grown alongside my admiration. And she shared, in her gentle, measured way, the quiet affection and recognition that she had felt, too, the moments when our proximity had felt natural, comforting, even essential. There was no rush to define what this meant, no need to label it immediately. It was enough to acknowledge that our connection was real and meaningful. Even as our emotions hovered between the familiar and the extraordinary, there was a sense of balance. She rested her hand lightly on mine, a deliberate touch that carried reassurance rather than claim. I brushed her hair behind her ear, careful and tender, savoring the weight of her trust. Every gesture was intentional yet gentle, a conversation without words that spoke of closeness, respect, and unspoken understanding. We lingered there, in the fading light, comfortable in the quiet of shared presence. The world outside, the judgments, the age difference, the expectations, faded into insignificance. What remained was the bond we had nurtured: trust, vulnerability, and a deep emotional intimacy that neither of us wanted to disrupt. The story's tension had found resolution not in a dramatic declaration or physical consummation, but in the recognition that we belonged, at least for now, in each other's emotional space. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we stood together, shoulders touching, a soft smile shared between us. We didn't need to define what came next, nor did we need promises we couldn't yet keep. The important thing was the awareness, the shared understanding, and the security of knowing that our connection was both safe and real. In that moment, I realized that slow-burn romance isn't about rushing to a conclusion. It's about savoring the journey, honoring the tension, and cherishing the subtle, quiet intimacies that make a bond unforgettable. This ending provides emotional resolution without rushing to a conventional romantic climax. It leaves the audience with a satisfying sense of warmth, intimacy, and human connection, showing that profound love and trust can exist in its purest, most respectful form, even when the future remains uncertain. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a slow-burn romance that lingers long after the video ends. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moment made your heart skip a beat.